me to do this project, I just got off working on this particular project within our organization. So since I have it fresh on my mind, I thought this would be a perfect one to use. So the topic is actually running liquid-based migration with using AWS Batch and integrating that with Circle CI. For those of you who's, I guess everyone's got DevOps background here. I don't know. I don't know. Kind of like a show of hands. Does everyone know what liquid-based is or what a database migration service is? I'll talk about that in a little bit. So here's just a little blurb about where I'm coming from. I work for a company called Dealerware. The Dealerware. This on the slide is our kind of like marketing slogan. We work with automated services. So we're a SaaS platform for automotive services, but for everything that we do as a platform engineering, we are using AWS. So there's, I would say like over 90%, maybe more of our infrastructure is on AWS. We use some third-party services outside of AWS for email, like SMS notification, and also DNS hosting. So those are outside of AWS, but everything else is in AWS. So we're a very heavy AWS shop. Myself, I'm a DevOps engineer in the company. I have a background as an Oracle database admin, and for a long time ago, I wrote C program, C-based like Unix-ish programs in the backend. So that's where I'm coming from. So going into the topic, I'm presenting the topic in a flow where I'd like to explain why we're doing the thing before we go into the actual doing it. I think it helps frame, give you the right mindset to go into a problem. So as Allison said, like help all engineering think about how we would architect something. This is a presentation that goes from like discussion of architecture going into implementation. So that's the flow of things. This is a quote recently. This was talking about some ideals this guy has. He's a big Apple fan. He loves Steve Jobs, like praises Steve Jobs like his god. So he talks about how they arrange their mindset, and this is loosely based on what that is. And we have, I arranged it kind of in this way. So why are we solving this problem? How do we come up with a solution? And what did we do for implementation? And we'll go to the question and answering session. First one, obviously, why are we doing this? Database migration is a common problem. Every service that you have every service that you have will have some kind of data backend. Important services will have a database backend, be that Aurora or Postgres or MySQL or DynamoDB, whatnot. And all of them will require updates. Database migration is the process of doing that database upgrade. Our engineering team needed something that's more uniform. So we had a legacy service that runs in EKS. So it's Kubernetes, it's running on Rails, and they have old Rails, well, I wouldn't say old, but traditional Rails data migration service that runs within Rails that I don't know how many of you guys are exposed to Rails. I don't know Rails much, but I know like it's just like a Rails migration. But we started breaking our old Rails application out to different services. So we're starting to build services using Lambda. We're starting to build services with ECS, and all of those needed backend database migration strategies, and they cannot use the old Rails migration. So they reached out to us. They had some ideas in mind. They weren't too sure how that's going to happen. So they reached out to us, say, hey, we need to collaborate on this project. We want to make sure that everything works properly and we can still release it through our CI/CD platform, which in our case, we only have Circle CI. We use Circle CI for both CI and CD, which is kind of not the ideal way, but I'll just kind of keep that in mind as I talk through the scenarios. And this is like when we discuss how do we do this. So the how is the architectural side. What do we think about? What do we need to research before going into this project? So obviously, the starting point is that from the engineering team, they needed to figure out which migration tool they want to use. They want to unify that. I think we have 3-4 different teams that needed database migration services, 2 that needed it immediately, and 2 projects needed it immediately. And they were very heavily bouncing back and forth about how would they do the database migration. So they had that discussion going on, and they realized, hey, without actually building that migration service and building the migration into CI/CD, they were not going to be able to automate that process. Unfortunately, that kind of got brought up a little late. So at the beginning, we actually had to manually run the database migrations for one of the projects. That was kind of the unfortunate side effects of making that discovery a little late. Obviously, engineering team, while they were doing that, they reached out to the DevOps team and say, hey, we have this idea and we wanted to make sure that we can run this in CI/CD. How can you guys think about how we would do this properly? So we started talking. They were saying, okay, they have some tool, they don't know what yet. So our discussion, this is the initial architectural background that we talked about. So, okay, you don't know what you're doing, that's fine, but everything will be a Docker container, so we can run your migration service or whatever service that you want to only one time run within a container. But how do we serve that container with our CI/CD process? At the time, the DevOps team just got off another project where we implemented ECS service. So we actually had a ECS module that was ready to use. So we thought, well, you know what? Let's see if we can use ECS. We'll just do one-time runs using ECS. Then kind of like send, I don't know if Allison remembered the discussion, but I was a little hesitant on that, but it was kind of like our senior engineers said, okay, let's just go down this route, do a discovery, see what happens. Then I went and did the ECS implementation, actually. So I got it about 80% there. At the time, the problem with the ECS, it has a pretty heavy setup overhead. The problem with that, you need to set up networking configuration for your ECS, as you probably know. We're not trying to set this up for as a shared service. So I think when we started first talking about it, we didn't scope it very well. We didn't think about, is this database migration service going to use the same backend service to run for every environment that we have as we break things out into feature environment, test, and production? And this lower environment being a very different networking setup as production. Sorry, I used our actual account names up here, but you get the idea. So the idea originally was okay, we'll use the ECS service, we'll create the cluster and call it the migration service. Then this service would be shared in between different environments. Lower environment would have its own ECS cluster, while production has its own ECS cluster. That's all well and fine, but we run into a problem where our feature environment networking is defined differently from our tested environment. And then also, our ECS module did not include ECR creation. So ECR had to be set up separately outside of our ECS cluster definition. So it becomes a issue where we're maintaining Terraform code. We're maintaining our infrastructure code in 2 or 3 separate places just to deploy in for this one particular product. And also networking and for this shared infrastructure became a blocker because we started trying to make sure that Circle CI can talk to different infrastructures, then it became a kind of a nightmare scenario. It's like, I wouldn't say nightmare, just a complicated scenario, more so than we care to do. So at that point, we pivoted, reviewed the way to run AWS batch, and found out that it's much simpler because everything is well contained by itself. We can build everything within the same feature environment or within the same environment. So every environment would be standalone. They wouldn't be impacting each other. We can build one up from end to end. We don't rely on any shared services, which is like very much the ideal scenario that we're striving for. So we ended up going that way. In the meantime, engineering team decided that Liquidbase is going to be their database migration tool. There was 2 competing decisions, basically Liquidbase versus Flyway. For the reasons, I wrote down the reasons, but there's a comparison between Liquidbase and Flyway. I think we ended up choosing Liquidbase only for 2 reasons. One is that most of our engineers do not have SQL experience. Flyway requires your database migration files to be written in SQL format. The other one is that, sorry, Flyway requires manual management of your file name to make sure that your database migrations are executed in order. They thought that was unnecessary overhead for what we're trying to do. So we scrapped the idea of using Flyway. Engineering decided to rely on Liquidbase. That's what their decision was. And for our decision, like I was saying, we decided to go back to AWS batch. I'll show you the actual final architectural diagram in a little bit. And then there's also a few other pieces that showed up, and I'll show that in the final architectural diagram. And after we made those decisions, this is the what did we do to actually implement this? And this is the end scenario. This ends up being very simple. And I wrote it in the way where you can see this application VPC as everything that's in the application VPC that's in this square is contained within every deployment, be that a feature branch deployment, or be that a test deployment, or be that production. Everything is self-contained. When your feature environment gets broken down, everything over here gets destroyed. There's no leftover. Everything's really clean. Obviously, we deploy everything through Terraform. We'll use and another piece that we had another engineer with us at the time where he did concept for using AWS batch after we made the decision, where he also found out that, hey, we can use CloudWatch event, and whenever we publish a Docker image, the CloudWatch event would just automatically push a job queue, push a job into the job queue for AWS batch, and then it would just run it automatically. Like, sure, that's great, awesome. We got to get it done. There was a few hiccups that the original didn't think about. One of them being that when you're pulling from ECR, you have it doesn't necessarily know which version to pull using the CloudWatch event. So CloudWatch event monitors everything, but when you push into it, it will say, you have these 4 images in your ECR. Am I doing everything? What am I doing? So in that CloudWatch event definition, we just made a decision. We only run the latest. Whenever we push the image to ECR, it will always have the latest tag. We'll always push the latest into the job queue. And we'll always wait until the job is done or failed before we continue in our CI. So down here you can kind of see the infrastructure that's built to support AWS batch. Here is the ECR. This is the monitoring for ECR event. We have a job definition for our database job. Pushes the job queue. This is the actual AWS batch definition. We have an execution role associated with it, which it doesn't have a line, but the role can read the database secret that has the database credentials. And then the batch job would just apply the database updates using Liquidbase. All the execution logs are pushed to CloudWatch, and we have a shell script that's running over here for verifying job status that would keep an eye on the execution log. And once the execution log says complete or failed, it would move to the next step. Another hiccup that we weren't thinking about, so this is when I went in and started implementing the actual CI/CD process, is that the way that we release our software. This line up here is strictly for database migration, but the way that our software is released, we have Terraform code associated with that particular project. So at the beginning, when CI starts, it would actually run all of our Terraform code and then move to the next step. So, but we don't want the Terraform code to actually release the code without the database migration was done first. So we ended up deciding to do a target apply for database and the database migration infrastructure. Then after we're done with this part, we would apply the rest of the infrastructure, which was not ideal, but at the time we couldn't figure out a good way to separate that. So this could be a discussion point. Like if you have some thoughts on that, feel free to share. I have not come up with a very good way to manage that. So this became a good template to use. I was able to write everything in a module, push out a white paper, and this became like a very easily implemented way. Then I did it for our lower environments, and the production team actually took over because I was going on vacation. The development team actually took over and implemented this to the production environment without much of a hiccup. So that was pretty good success. That's really it. It's a pretty quick. Like I said, this is a pretty quick discussion. So I don't know, like, who has questions, who might, if you have questions about what we did, or feel free to ask me now.
Awesome, Peter. I will break up the ice here and start doing the question part. Right. So first of all, congratulations for the job, and everything that you said makes a lot of sense in terms of organization. I like the approach that you guys took, but I saw the schematics that you showed, and something flew across my mind. So did you guys consider CloudFormation for that?
We actually don't use CloudFormation for our infrastructure. There was a discussion about moving to CloudFormation for some of our pieces, but we, as the DevOps team, we made a decision to not use anything outside of Terraform to manage our infrastructure. So that was the decision that was made outside of this project, really.
I see, because a couple of things that you showed, they are solved by CloudFormation in general, but I understand why you wouldn't choose that if you have already the rest of the things in Terraform. So it would be like two things to manage, so it can give you a heartache sometimes. Okay, that's that. Thank you. So I open up. So guys, feel free to ask anything, including asking in Portuguese. I can do the translation if necessary. So go ahead. You guys can start raising your hands if you want to ask anything to Peter right now.
I have a quick question for you, Peter. Right. So, actually, I'm not João Lobo, right? I'm Alisson Viana.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm just using this account to record in this video, right? So, yeah. I think you show us the life cycle of this project, right? But I would like to understand with you what you had in mind about this project, because I guess you have to monitoring this process in general, right? My question is, did you had in mind to create any project monitoring, or you hope monitoring what you made in this project or something like that? Could you share with us?
So for monitoring, so you're talking about monitoring and alerting specific for this project, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so monitoring, it was pretty minimal because this is just database patch apply. So we aren't very concerned about large scale failures. Everything is one time, and AWS batch is actually pretty straightforward. Once you set it up, it just you kind of think of it as a job executioner. For those who haven't really played with AWS batch before, I would recommend actually going through some examples and play with it. So the only monitoring I was done was the CloudWatch logs. It was the everything you run in AWS. So when you define, sorry, let me back up a little bit. When you define the job definition for your AWS batch, it would tell you like you can define output for the logs to go. So in our case, we tell it to forward all the output to a CloudWatch logs, and our validating script, basically this script that runs in Circle CI, would just keep an eye. It will keep an eye on the CloudWatch log output, and that was really all the monitoring that it did. Outside of that, monitoring for this project, there's separate monitorings for this project, but outside of that is specific for database migration. CloudWatch log was the only thing I needed to use. If that makes sense.
Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, good evening. Thank you for presentation. So I have question. In my case, I always find it very complicated to migrate database. In fact, I find it difficult. And your diagram, it seems to be easy. I think it's that what SQL CI brings to be easy. I never use SQL CI. I always use a Azure pipeline for this, for example. Another question: it's SQL CI. It's free?
No, Circle CI is not. I do think think about migration as just a part of your release process. I don't think complicated is a different way of saying like this is like there may be an issue with your release process. I think with the release process, you want to always think about when you release your software, what logical pieces needs to happen. So if you're running database migrations in different places, or if you're running into like permission issues or other kind of problems, I don't know specifically what kind of problems you're running into, but to me, it always has been a logical order problem. So you always want to do your database migration before you do your code release, and you can put validation in your database migration before the code release goes out. So that's how our in my past experiences anyway, that's how we would manage the database migrations. So one part of clarification, migration does not, like the migration we talk over here is more like a database update. We're not talking about moving a database from one environment to another or copying data from one to the other. That's not what this is about. I always get confused with that terminology, but that is what the development team has being used to saying. So I want to make sure that's not what you're talking about.
Nice. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, can I make the next question?
Yeah.
So, Peter, thank you for your presence here. It's really grateful to see someone like you here. And my question is about how long does it take usually to build the whole process, like to create everything and to change from a place to another? How long does it take?
We had, so it was myself and another engineer who unfortunately is no longer with us. The proof of concept took probably one sprint. We have 2-week sprints, so took him about a sprint to do. Then the actual implementation took me about 2 sprints because I was also working on some other projects. But I think if you're talking about doing something end to end and someone focused on it, you should be able to implement this within the sprint, within like a 2-week work period. The thing that I want to make sure that, so the thing that caught us unaware is the kind of the, like I was saying, like the logical moving pieces. So the things that took me a little, like why it took me like more, I think it ended up taking me a little more than 2 sprints to do the actual implementation, because I ran into the problem where the release ordering was weird. So originally we thought, okay, we could just do the database release along with everything else, but then come to find out that, oh no, we have to make sure the application code doesn't actually get released. And there is no, because it's this particular project uses Lambda functions, so there's no, it's not like ECS where you can version, version your code release. So we can't just release everything, then do a validation and roll the code over to the new version, roll the ECS task definition to a newer version. Over here, like once we release Lambda, it's out there. So we have to make sure that the database migration is done before the Lambda job, and that kind of took us a little back and forth. Also, the shell script that monitors call watch, that was kind of a weird thing that we had to do outside of our normal monitoring job. So that took me a couple of days to write, but that was, I think, the most pain point I had. Oh, actually, I take that back. Yeah, so with Circle CI, I think you'll run into this with any CI tool. When we create the environment, you have to feed this back. So I don't know if you guys can see my mouse cursor, but can you see my mouse cursor if I move it around?
Yes.
Okay. So this piece where it starts the data migration, before this happens, there's a Terraform piece that builds everything. So the build has to feed back the ECR image back into the migration, so that this part knows where to publish that Docker image. Within Circle CI, and using Terraform, that is not super straightforward. We have to kind of like do a bit of, we have to send the Terraform output into a temporary workspace within Circle CI and touch that workspace through different CI processes, so that the later CI processes knows the ECR where to publish the image into, and also knows like the actual batch queue name. So that was kind of a funny thing, but I think for the people who's very experienced with like CI/CD process, that's probably something you run into daily. I was just caught a little unaware of that. So that was, yeah, that's why, like, when I say someone who's pretty familiar with the process, you can probably do it within a sprint. I don't think it's a very hard thing to do. Yeah.
Awesome, Peter. Peter, I thank you.
Hey Igor, sorry, we can't hear you. Yeah, sorry Igor, we can't hear you. Your voice is like robotic. Your sound's very bad. We cannot hear you. If you want, you can type your question on the chat.
Is it better now?
Yes.
A little bit better, but still bad.
Awesome. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah.
Awesome. So you're saying about the verified job status, right? How it get information about the cluster and what the job has as a status. Can you clarify? Because in my understanding, we are starting the process here by the CloudWatch start, and this is a synchronous process, right? So how are you fetching that information? Do you have any results, or do you need to pull multiple times some API on AWS side to verify?
Sorry, it's a little very muddled, so I can barely make out what you're asking. Can you talk just a little slower? I think then it will help.
And maybe a little bit closer to the microphone too.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand about the verified job status, because it's an asynchronous process, right? Because from the CloudWatch event, we start the job, and then I was wondering how we fetch that information. If you need to pull the AWS API in order to discover it.
Oh yeah. So we have everything automated. So this job queue name is very specific, the way that we described it. So it knows. So once I know the job queue before the starting point, this is like there's Terraform code before start that builds all the infrastructure, which we keep the name of the ECR and we keep the name of the AWS batch queue. So in my shell script, I just provided the input of the batch queue, and I provided with a starting time. So this is kind of like once it publishes it, it takes about 2 to 5 seconds for this job to go into the job queue and actually get started. So in this job status, I would, this is kind of a hack. I don't really like it, but so I would just wait for, I would let it wait for a couple seconds, then start checking the queue that was, checking the queue output. This CloudWatch log is also a known variable from this job creation, right? So I would already know the queue I'm looking for, the CloudWatch log group that I need to look at to get the output from. So all that the shell script does is that it makes sure that it looks at a job that's created for this queue within the last, let's say, 2 to 5 seconds. If anything is older, I ignore that. So monitor the latest job run, then monitor the status of the batch run, and also have another side that keeps on telling the CloudWatch log. And that is all that the job status verification is doing. And once our AWS batch process finishes running, it will return the result of complete. I forgot the actual status name. I think it's either complete or error, or there's another one for the end of status. So so it would just look at that status and report back to Circle CI saying that if this is completed or if it ran into a failure. Then we continue our Circle CI steps based on the output of that. Does that answer your question, hopefully?
Yes, it makes sense. And also, you mentioned that the job itself, it starts in like 2 or 3 seconds, but how much time does it take to complete?
It depends on the migration. Most of our migrations, our database is pretty small for this project. So our migration usually completes within about 10 seconds. Then output, everything gets in the output. In my past life as a database admin, I do have like migration that runs a lot longer. But because AWS batch has a limitation, I know AWS batch has a limitation of how long a job can run, but you can kind of like tweak with that. But for most of our jobs, it's very short-lived. So that's not a worry that we needed to have. So.
Awesome. And since the job is so short, have you thought about using Lambda for it instead of ECS batch? So you can have like the same ephemeral environment as you were looking for?
Using what? Sorry, you're dropped out.
Using Lambda, AWS Lambda.
AWS.
Lambda.
Oh, Lambdas. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
We thought about Lambda, but to write the Lambda code and also to maintain that is a separate piece. So the release process would be further complicated. So we wanted to get away from having to do more networking definition and roles. So that's why we kind of like stayed away. Like ECS was like a huge, like a bigger thing, but Lambda, I forgot why. Let me think about this a little bit. So we talked about using Lambda, but I think because running Flyway was a little difficult to put that in a container to run Lambda, we kind of gave up on that idea. I don't remember what the problem was though. I think that was done with the research when another engineer was looking at it. But definitely an alternative that I can do. Lambda would be more persisting though. So the AWS job, like this is a very short running job, and once you just run it and it completes and done. Lambda would mean that something persists and you have to make an API call. It has to do a warm up and it has to run the actual process. So the total CPU cycle might end up being a little longer than AWS batch, but I haven't really done a comparison. But good question. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
No, that's a good answer. I was just wondering what were your thoughts on that, and also I asked that because I worked in a project a few years ago, and we did almost the same, but not for database migrations. We were basically doing integration tests, but the idea is the same. We need to like create a very small and ephemeral environment for just a few minutes, and then just destroy everything. And we went for that in the back time, But overall, the architectures are close to just have the communication with the pipeline, and that's why I asked it. Thank you. Nice presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, short and sweet. Sorry, I didn't prepare myself to share any of our code. But if I get some time to actually push the AWS batch module out to a public Git repo, I would definitely share with you guys on that. Like I said, it's not very complicated. It should be. It's fairly simple. So. Yeah, and everything, I think, all the problems that we had during this project, that's the one thing I wanted to share. Like, I think walking into all the projects, like doing a good design session is important. We didn't really need to go into the ECS cycle. I think I would rather spend time with Lambda and batch than trying to work around building something like a full ECS cluster to be able to manage some simple job like this, right? It doesn't quite make sense from the start. But it's something that I didn't fight for myself very well, and that's something I'm still learning. Like, as we do architectural discussions, we have to feedback, like we have to be very specific in our feedback, saying that why we want to do certain things in a certain way so that it doesn't waste company time. That was my kind of like my takeaway with it. So do you have any other questions, comments?
I have another question here. Can you share like how it's going to use SQL with AWS? Because we need to have like some integrations, right? We need to share some secrets. And I've used code build in the past, and it's a very smooth experience being already inside the AWS environment. So I was going to use Circle CI with AWS.
So you're talking about specifically how we manage and access the database secrets?